The trouble began long before the first envelope arrived, though at the time, the homeowner never imagined anything unusual was happening. Life in the community had always felt predictable, almost mundane in its routine of quiet weekdays and slow-moving weekends. The houses looked the same, the mail came on schedule, and the HOA existed mostly as a background entity, annoying at times but never intrusive. That peaceful equilibrium shattered the morning he discovered a bright orange notice plastered to his front door that IT claimed he was in violation of multiple HOA regulations. The offenses listed were vague and strangely broad, referring to unsightly exterior conditions and failure to maintain community standards. The fines totaled more than he believed was reasonable, especially since nothing about his property had changed in months. His lawn was trimmed, his paint was fresh, and his trash cans were stored where they had always been. He stood there on the porch, staring at the notice, trying to understand what could possibly be prompting this sudden escalation. At first, he assumed it was a clerical error, some mix-up, perhaps a neighbor's complaint mistakenly directed at the wrong address. But before he could reach out to the HOA office, the second notice arrived, followed by a third. Each was more urgent, more threatening, and more financially burdensome than the last. The tone of the letters shifted quickly from administrative formality to outright intimidation, warning of additional penalties, legal action, property liens, and eventual seizure. He felt the slow creep of panic as he laid the notices across his kitchen counter, forming a timeline of harassment. Each notice contradicted the one before it, mixing accusations of overgrown vegetation with claims of unauthorized structural changes. Not a single one contained photographs or proof, only written assertions and the board's signature. For the first time since moving into the neighborhood, he felt targeted. As he attempted to contact the HOA office, he found the board strangely unreachable. Phone calls went to voicemail, emails bounced back with automated responses. And when he tried to visit the office in person, he found the door locked, lights off, and a sign claiming the office was under limited hours due to administrative restructuring. Yet during this supposed restructuring, the fines continued to escalate with mechanical consistency. It became increasingly clear that this wasn't random. Someone, or perhaps multiple board members, wanted him pressured, cornered, and financially drained. But the question remained, why? His first step was to look through the HOA bylaws, a dense stack of documents that most residents never bothered to read. As he combed through the regulations, he discovered that many of the alleged violations weren't violations at all. Some sections of the bylaws contradicted the claims entirely, and others contained ambiguous language that the board seemed to be twisting for their own purposes. It was as though someone had weaponized the rulebook to create an illusion of wrongdoing. One detail stood out among the chaos. Every fine notice was signed by the same board member, the treasurer. Her name appeared on each letter, accompanied by a bold, aggressive stamp that made the fines feel judicial rather than administrative. He had seen her at meetings, though barely. She rarely spoke, but her presence commanded attention. Rumor around the neighborhood suggested she was the real decision-maker behind the scenes, despite the HOA having an official president. The treasurer's involvement raised a new suspicion. Perhaps the fines weren't just malicious, they were profitable. He began documenting everything. He photographed his property from every angle, collected copies of all notices, and saved every bounced email. If this escalated into something legal, he wanted a full record. Still, documentation alone wouldn't stop an HOA determined to take action. What he needed was leverage, something that forced them to back down. One night, after yet another notice landed in his mailbox, he sat awake long after midnight, staring at the stack of paperwork. The language of the fines had reached a new level of aggression, warning of imminent escalated measures, which he suspected meant they might soon pursue a lien against his home. The more he read, the more he realized he had two choices: pay or fight. Paying wasn't an option. Fighting, however, was starting to feel like a necessity. He remembered something a neighbor once mentioned, an offhand comment during a block party about the HOA's poor financial transparency. Apparently, the board had failed to release the standard annual financial statements for 2 consecutive years. Someone had questioned it in a meeting and was brushed aside with excuses about administrative delays and ongoing audits. At the time, it sounded like typical HOA bureaucracy. Now, it sounded like the edge of a thread he needed to pull. The next morning, he started digging into the HOA's publicly available documents. He expected the process to be slow, but instead, he found inconsistency after inconsistency. The latest budget report was incomplete. The previous year's report was missing entirely. Meeting minutes referenced votes that had never been communicated to residents. And in multiple places, financial line items appeared vague, inflated, or suspiciously duplicated. The deeper he dug, the more the pattern emerged. Someone had been playing with numbers boldly, sloppily, and for far too long. But the real breakthrough came when he examined the HOA fee increases over the last 3 years. They had risen dramatically, but there was no corresponding increase in community maintenance or improvement projects. In fact, several facilities, including the community pool and clubhouse, had been closed indefinitely for budget shortages. Yet fees kept rising, and fines, particularly fines from the treasurer's office, had become startlingly common. A troubling possibility began to form in his mind. What if the fines weren't meant to regulate behavior? What if they were meant to fill a hole, one created by mismanagement or worse, by deliberate theft? He needed proof, something beyond the surface-level documents, something internal. That opportunity came unexpectedly when he discovered that the HOA website had an outdated administrator portal that, astonishingly, still functioned. With only a few minutes of trial-and-error login attempts, he found himself looking at restricted files. Spreadsheets labeled with financial periods, scanned receipts, budget drafts, and internal memos. The disorganization was overwhelming, but within the noise he found exactly what he feared. There were payments to unknown vendors, repeated charges for non-existent services, and invoices that appeared manufactured. Some receipts included the treasurer's personal signature next to vague descriptions like community service fees and emergency maintenance expenditures. The documents were riddled with red flags, enough to suggest serious financial misconduct, and then, buried deep in a folder mislabeled as miscellaneous, he found the document that made everything click, an internal memo discussing an urgent need to recover funds before the upcoming state audit. It was written by the treasurer herself. She emphasized aggressive enforcement of community fines as a solution. Suddenly, it all made sense. The fines weren't about violations. They were about money. His property was never the target. His wallet was. As he sat back in his chair, absorbing the full weight of what he'd discovered, the fear that had haunted him for weeks began shifting into something else. Resolve. The HOA wasn't just abusing power. They were covering up a scandal that could implode the entire board. They had crossed the wrong homeowner. And now he had the leverage he needed. The discovery of the treasurer's memo marked a turning point, not only in the homeowner's understanding of the situation but in his sense of agency. Up until that moment, he had been on defense, reacting, scrambling, collecting scraps of evidence in the hope they might someday matter. But now, as he stared at the damning memo with its thinly veiled admission of financial desperation, a new clarity settled over him. The HOA wasn't an untouchable authority. It was a fragile structure held together by secrecy, incompetence, and greed. And secrets, once exposed, could topple even the most rigid institutions. He knew the documents he had uncovered would be invaluable, but possessing them wasn't enough. He needed to verify their authenticity, connect the dots, and build a narrative strong enough to withstand scrutiny. In the world of HOA politics, accusations without airtight evidence were easily dismissed. The treasurer and her allies would deny wrongdoing, claim the files were outdated or taken out of context, and shift blame onto anyone who dared challenge them. If he wanted to bring down the board, he had to do it methodically. His first step was to categorize the evidence. He created folders, real ones on his desk, not digital, labeling each according to its contents. Invoices, budgets, meeting minutes, emails, vendor lists, enforcement notices. The sheer volume of disorganization within the HOA's internal files suggested years of mishandling, which made sorting through them feel like navigating a maze designed to exhaust anyone who entered. Yet underneath the chaos was a clear pattern of financial misappropriation. The treasurer had been funneling money into shell accounts disguised as vendors. Payments were duplicated, triplicate, and occasionally disguised as refunds that had never been distributed to residents. As he continued reviewing the files, he noticed something else. The escalation of fines correlated almost perfectly with dips in the HOA's financial reserves. Every time the balance dropped below a certain threshold, the treasurer issued a wave of citations across the community. Residents who had never been fined before suddenly found themselves facing obscure violations. The homeowner now realized his case wasn't unique. It was part of a broader strategy to force residents into padding the HOA's accounts. T.O. confirmed this. He reached out discreetly to his neighbors. He didn't mention the documents or the treasurer's memo, but instead asked whether they had received fines recently. The responses came quickly, too quickly. Multiple households had been hit with citations for trivial or fabricated violations. A family had been fined for unauthorized garden trimming, despite having no garden. Another was cited for curbside obstruction, even though their cars were parked legally in their driveway. People had paid these fines reluctantly, fearing retaliation or foreclosure threats. The pattern was unmistakable. While gathering these testimonies, the homeowner kept his investigation quiet. He didn't trust the board not to retaliate in ways he couldn't anticipate. He also worried that any hint of suspicion might lead the treasurer to start destroying evidence. The outdated admin portal he used to access the files could be disabled at any moment if someone discovered the vulnerability. Every night, after work, he would sit at his computer, logged into that fragile portal, downloading everything of importance and backing it up to an external drive locked in his desk drawer. But the deeper he dug, the more dangerous his findings became. One evening, he discovered a document that suggested the treasurer wasn't acting alone. The file, labeled Board Reconciliation Notes, contained handwritten annotations by the HOA president. The president had been fully aware of the financial discrepancies and had even suggested ways to reclassify suspicious expenses to make them appear legitimate. His handwriting appeared in the margins alongside remarks about narrative alignment and controlling optics. The document read less like meeting notes and more like a crisis management plan designed to protect the board at all costs. This revelation shifted the scope of the corruption. What he had initially thought was the work of a single rogue treasurer was, in fact, a coordinated effort among multiple board members. The president, secretary, and treasurer had all participated in manipulating finances and suppressing transparency. The homeowner suspected that the remaining board members were either complicit or too intimidated to intervene. With this knowledge came new risk. If the board discovered he had infiltrated their records, they wouldn't simply fine him. They would come after him legally, perhaps even attempt to seize his home under the guise of violation enforcement. He had seen how aggressively they wielded the rulebook. They would weaponize every line if it meant protecting themselves. He also began noticing subtle signs that the board might already sense resistance brewing. The HOA's email blasts increased in frequency, filled with condescending reminders and warnings about non-compliance. A new notice appeared on the HOA website discussing forthcoming policy reinforcement measures. And one morning, he found a board member's car parked unusually close to his house, lingering for far longer than any reasonable visit would require. He suspected they were monitoring him, though he couldn't prove it. Recognizing the danger, he knew he needed allies. He reached out to a small group of neighbors he trusted, people who had expressed frustration with the HOA's growing tyranny. He didn't tell them everything yet, but he hinted that he had uncovered serious irregularities. They were immediately intrigued, perhaps even relieved someone had finally taken action. Two of them mentioned they had backgrounds in accounting and law, offering to help quietly analyze the documents if needed. Their involvement strengthened his resolve. With support from other residents, he no longer felt isolated. The HOA had built its power on the assumption that individuals wouldn't unite. But a collective effort had the potential to expose everything. As he continued preparing his case, he began planning how to deliver the information. Reporting to the state regulatory board was one option, but investigations could take months. The treasurer could cover her tracks during that time. Another option was to call a community meeting, but the board controlled the schedule and format of such gatherings, often shutting down dissent with procedural tactics. The homeowner knew they would never allow him to present what he had found. Then he considered a third choice, one that balanced immediacy with impact. releasing the information publicly, all at once, to every resident. A coordinated email blast. Printed packets delivered to every doorstep. Evidence laid out clearly, irrefutably, with instructions for residents on how to demand a formal audit and vote to remove the board. But before he could finalize that plan, something happened that confirmed he had little time left. A new notice arrived. Not a fine this time, but a pre-lien warning. The board claimed he owed thousands in unpaid violations, threatening legal action if payment wasn't received by the end of the month. This wasn't just intimidation anymore. It was a direct step toward taking his home. Instead of fear, a surge of determination coursed through him. This move was reckless, desperate, and exactly the mistake he needed them to make. The board had overplayed its hand. They had given him the opening to expose everything. That he looked at the notice one final time, then placed it atop the growing stack of evidence. The time for quiet investigation was ending. The time for strategic retaliation had begun. The pre-lien warning acted as a catalyst, pushing the homeowner from silent investigator to active strategist. The threat of losing his home, his most valuable asset, the place he had built a life in, solidified his commitment. What had started as confusion and fear had become a mission to dismantle a corrupt system built on intimidation, secrecy, and greed. And if the HOA board believed a final, aggressive notice would force him into submission, they fundamentally misunderstood the resolve of the person they were targeting. The homeowner knew that the moment he took action, the board would retaliate. But waiting any longer would put him at risk of losing control of the narrative, something the treasurer and president were experts at manipulating. Everything he had uncovered had to be presented in a way that was clear, coherent, and impossible for the board to twist. The community needed to see the truth without distortion. He began assembling a detailed report, formatting it like a formal dossier. Every invoice was paired with an explanation, every bank statement with a highlighted inconsistency. He included charts, graphs, and side-by-side comparisons showing the discrepancies between actual expenditures and those reported in the HOA's official statements. He also prepared a timeline demonstrating exactly when the board began issuing increased fines and how closely these spikes aligned with suspicious withdrawals from the HOA's reserve account. The internal memo he had discovered, the treasurer's admission of financial desperation, became the centerpiece of the entire package. It provided motive, context, and intent. Around it, he built a narrative strong enough to withstand scrutiny and clear enough for every homeowner, no matter their background, to understand. His next step was distribution. The HOA's official communication channels were off-limits, controlled by the board, monitored, and censored. He needed a method that would reach all residents simultaneously while avoiding interception. With the help of the neighbors who had quietly supported him, he compiled a list of every homeowner's mailing address. After days of printing, organizing, and sealing envelopes, the group set a date. Before dawn on a Saturday morning, they would deliver the packets to every doorstep. But the homeowner didn't stop at paper distribution. He also prepared a digital version of the report, saved as a secure, non-editable file. Using an anonymous email account, he scheduled a mass email blast time to hit inboxes shortly after the physical packets landed on porches. In that same email, he included a link to a shared drive with all raw evidence, untouched documents exactly as he found them in the admin portal. He wanted total transparency, leaving no room for claims of altered evidence. The night before distribution, he barely slept. He replayed every possibility in his mind, the board denying the allegations, accusing him of hacking, trying to claim the documents were fabricated. He knew they would fight back. The question was how far they would go to maintain their power. When dawn finally came, the neighborhood was quiet. Shadows stretched long across the sidewalks as he and his small group of allies moved from house to house, placing thick envelopes on doorsteps. The sky turned from gray to pale blue by the time they finished. The homeowner walked back to his house with a mix of anticipation and apprehension. Everything was now in motion. Within hours, the neighborhood erupted. Residents began stepping outside with envelopes in their hands, their expressions shifting from confusion to shock as they scanned the contents. Some lingered on their driveways, others returned to their homes to read more thoroughly. Conversations started almost immediately, first in hushed tones between neighbors, then louder as word spread that the treasurer and president had been systematically draining the HOA's finances. Then came the digital wave. Phones chimed simultaneously as the email blast reached every inbox. The shared drive link circulated rapidly, and within minutes, dozens of residents began reviewing documents that had been hidden from them for years. The raw evidence removed any sliver of doubt. The community had been exploited. The board, caught off guard, scrambled to respond. The HOA website was updated with a generic message claiming the documents were misinterpreted, though the message lacked specificity. Then the treasurer sent a mass email denying wrongdoing and accusing certain parties of breaking into the HOA's system. However, her response was laced with panic, full of contradictions and defensive language that made her appear even more guilty. By midday, the residents had organized an emergency meeting. This time, the board had no power to delay it, because the homeowners invoked a clause in the bylaws that allowed a majority of residents to call a special session without board approval. The homeowners gathered in the community park, bypassing the HOA-controlled clubhouse. More than 100 people attended, far more than ever showed up to an HOA meeting before. The homeowner did not stand at the front. He had no desire to become the face of the conflict or to turn the exposure into a personal victory. Instead, he watched from the side as neighbors reflected on their own experiences, shared the emotional and financial stress caused by months of baseless fines, and expressed outrage at the betrayal of trust. A retired accountant from the community stepped forward and explained, in simple terms, how the treasurer and president had created the illusion of financial scarcity to justify aggressive enforcement. A pair of homeowners who had been fined excessively described the pressure they faced and the near loss of their homes. The mood of the crowd evolved from confusion to anger to determination. The board members eventually arrived, attempting to regain control. The president tried to claim the meeting was illegitimate. The treasurer insisted the documents were doctored. But each argument crumbled under scrutiny. Residents confronted them directly, armed with evidence printed in the packets. The treasurer's shaky denials only deepened suspicion. The president's attempts to shift blame were met with jeers. In the face of overwhelming pressure, the board members had no defense left. By late afternoon, the homeowners held a vote of no confidence. The treasurer, president, and secretary were removed from their positions by a landslide. A temporary committee was appointed to take over operations immediately, tasked with stabilizing the finances, commissioning a professional audit, and drafting a plan to restore transparency. While the former board members retreated, some silently, others muttering threats of legal action they had no grounds to pursue, the community turned to the homeowner. Word spread quickly that he had been the one who uncovered the truth. People approached him with gratitude, shaking his hand, thanking him for his courage and persistence. Though he hadn't sought recognition, he accepted their thanks with humility. In the following weeks, the external audit commenced, revealing the full depth of the financial misconduct. Tens of thousands of dollars had been siphoned away over several years. Legal proceedings began shortly after, resulting in charges against the treasurer and, eventually, the president. The secretary, though implicated, cooperated extensively and received lesser penalties. The community began healing. Projects that had been delayed were finally funded. Fees stabilized. Fines returned to their original purpose, enforcing genuine violations rather than extorting innocent families. Meetings became more transparent, recorded, and accessible. As for the homeowner, he returned to his normal routine, though his perspective on community governance had permanently changed. He kept copies of all the documents he had uncovered, not out of fear, but as a reminder of what people could accomplish when they refused to be silent. The ordeal had been exhausting, stressful, and at times frightening. But in the end, he hadn't just cleared his name. He had restored integrity to a fractured community and brought accountability to those who abused their power. And though he never asked for it, his quiet act of persistence became a story the neighborhood would remember for years, an example of how one homeowner, when